So, the topic of today's event is, do humans need God? And this title carries with it different assumptions to different people. So let's break down by asking more basic questions. What is a need, and what exactly do humans need? Or what are human needs? Well, a need is defined as something that is required because it is necessary, essential, or simply something very important, according to many dictionary definitions. Furthermore, need depends on what your goals or aims are. If you want a degree, you need to attend a college or university. If your aim is to get a job, you need to make a job application or at least ask people who might be able to get you into that job. And if humans want to have a justification to be consistently moral and be moral for morality's sake, they need to have something that is unchanging, intentional, ever-watching, and defining of human existence over them in order to provide humans with a consistent and constant intellectual justification and meaning to be moral. Otherwise, the pursuit of morality is conditioned on only convenience and ulterior motives born of self-interest and mercurial human emotions, which do not produce a consistent justification to be moral at all times and places. I therefore wish to argue that there can be no other substitute for God, whether it is a totalitarian police state or relying on the capriciousness of individual humans and their individual emotions and tastes, which is akin to anarchism. And I'll demonstrate that not only is it morality, but our very existence and our continued existence depends on the creator of reality itself, which is God. So first, let's go into morality. What is it to be moral? What does a moral mean? Does anyone have any suggestions? What is a moral? Does no one know what morality is? Any suggestion? Any brave? Did you have your hand up? Yep.
It's like adhering to a specific code of ethics.
And what are ethics?
Like a way by which you determine what is right and wrong.
What is right and wrong?
Yeah. Like if you're religious, it would be like the precepts of your sacred text. Or if you're not religious, it could be some philosophy that you or some other individual came up with at some point.
But what is right and wrong? How would you define right and wrong itself?
I think that, from from a philosophy point of view, they debated that and they said it depends on the action or the consequence of your action. If it leads,
I know, but what fundamentally is right and wrong? How would you explain it to a child?
I mean, one answer is utilitarianism. So if it's maximizing benefits to the largest number of people.
All these are justifications for right and wrong, which people bring. But what is the definition of right and wrong itself? Like, how would you define those words? Or I'll help you. What is good or bad? What is the definition of good and the definition of bad? Sister there?
A definition could be what is beneficial for you, and the definition of bad, what's not beneficial for you.
So if you define what is beneficial for you as good, then a person stealing money from someone on the street, perhaps, if they could get away with it, would then be good because it could be beneficial. But again, these are all justifications of good and bad. What is actually fundamentally the definition of good and bad as a word? So the word good, what does it mean? Word bad, what does it mean? The most fundamental words that we use, even the kids use the word good and bad. But what does it mean, brother?
Good is something that most people like, and bad is something that most people are find it to be reprehensible.
That most people, but not all people. And again, that's a justification as to what, or a determine, or what you're producing is a criteria for how to label things good and bad. But I'm talking about a definition of the label itself. Anyone else? I have one last contributor. Oh, no, the sister from there. Put her hand up first.
So wouldn't it be subjective? There would be no point in trying to define because it's all subjective. It's basically a set of characters that you can define as either being good or bad that help you.
Okay, so the sister is saying, is good and bad subjective? Well, what people label as good and bad is subjective, but we're talking about something more fundamental, which is the word itself. But this highlights the very problem of morality, meaning, because good and bad, if you detach it from anything else, any other objective reality, let's just say, you're just trying to find a definition of the word itself, it's very hard to actually have a meaning for those words. In fact, children will learn the meaning of good and bad usually through reward and pleasure from their parents. So they know that they do a bad deed, that this is called a bad deed, and there's repercussions for that. And repercussions that they don't enjoy. And if they do a good deed, they know there's repercussions for that. It's called reward, and they attach it to this label called good or a good deed. And that's fundamentally, it's like color in a way. How do you define orange? How do you define blue? You can't really define it with any reference to any other word. It's actually based on sensation. So good and bad itself are arbitrary and dependent on what you believe or what you want to label good or what you want to label bad. But the more important thing is that there is nothing physical in this universe that is defining or is a measure of good and bad. If you look into the microscope or you look in a telescope, you will not find good or bad. If you break down something into its component atoms or particles, subatomic particles, you won't find this thing called good and bad. In other cases, you could say the same thing for justice and other types of concepts, which are all metaphysical concepts. Metaphysical as in they're not physical, but they are meant to be about the physical world. So they're meant to be used in the physical world to describe things. Like law. Law doesn't exist as a objective, reality, an object. It's actually just ink on paper, and we attribute to it meaning and value. And this is the debate where we're going to have today is, where does meaning and value arrive from? And where does it come from? So if you want to determine that morals should be originated by human beings, the problem that arises is, which human beings do you take as your authority that have a right over you to give you the labels of good and bad, that you will take unquestioningly as right in all circumstances and wrong in all circumstances, depending on what they have taught you. So morals are not actions or intentions themselves. Morals are simply the values behind actions. So morals are a judgment of whether an action is good or an action is bad. But like all values, as I said, the value is determined based on which criterion you are choosing or which authority you choose. Example, in your wallets, you all have pieces of paper. These pieces of paper are very prized in this society. They are highly sought after, and people will do work for these pieces of paper, and they will do favors for each other for these pieces of paper. These pieces of paper have no other value than paper. If you were to give them to, let's say, a hypothetical caveman, the caveman would take this paper and probably use it as kindling to start their fire, because that's the maximum value they could ever get out of a piece of paper. But what gives it the value is a central authority in a land, which is a government or central bank. And the central bank promises to pay the bearer of this particular piece of paper the value of whatever denomination is on that paper. So it's because there is a bank and a government that has enforced, by force, value to these pieces of paper, we attribute value to them, and we are confident that all that hard work you did the day before in your jobs, when you're given that piece of paper, you take that as suitable payment and for your activities. But it remains pieces of paper, and it's just the values that we put on it. But if the Bank of Canada or the government of Canada was to tomorrow no longer exist, those pieces of paper would be worthless, in as much as if the people themselves either continue to use them or not. But if they didn't continue to use them, these pieces of paper would have no value. So we rely on something else to give us our values of any particular action and any particular object. And so today we're going to ask, what is a suitable criteria for the values behind the actions? And that is really what we're going to discuss. So usually the argument that you will get from many places is they say that human beings know that they can't exist in a society without some kind of regulatory body, otherwise it would be anarchy. So they say that enlightened self-interest moves each individual human who wants to avoid pain and seek pleasure, and views that an anarchic society is not the best case scenario for them for achieving maximum pleasure for the individual and minimal pain. So they create a government, and that they say that this government and its law will act as the moral foundation for that society because they're seeking self-interest, because they're seeking, in order to protect themselves, they should respect other people's rights within that society. So they say that this is sufficient to pursue a consistent morality. However, it is not sufficient. Now, firstly, I use the word consistent morality. I didn't just say morality. And I use the word consistent because it has to be a morality that functions at every case on any particular scenario that you can imagine. So, for example, defending someone is generally who's being mistreated is a good action. But would you engage to defend someone who is being robbed at knife point with the possibility that you yourself could be hurt? Many people would judge it not to be in their self-interest to do so. So then their morality wouldn't be consistent because they'd be doing an action based on whether it benefits themselves or whether it is convenient for themselves. Let's give other situations. Basically, in life, as we all know, it's not always convenient to be moral, and sometimes there is material advantage not being moral, and this is the problem that most moral systems who are based on material values find. Example, what is the purpose of being a moral nation when there are weaker nations out there which can be exploited for their wealth, for their resources, of which there are other nations who want to seek that wealth and resources? And so what limitations are upon any nation to attack or to take the resources of other countries? And the reason why I say this is because what people say is it should be in the enlightened self-interest of every individual to obey the laws of the land, to obey the morals of the land, because if they don't, it will affect everybody and the society will collapse and they'll be back to a state of chaos and anarchy. That's what the argument is. So if people aren't following the laws, it will become a state of anarchy and chaos, and the society will collapse, and that's in no one's interest. But what they don't realize is there's so many actions you can do which don't destroy society, which are amoral, and you get benefit out of them. Just ask the natives of Canada about the morality of these nations invading them a couple hundreds of years ago. You see, these nations, the ancestors of the colonialists that came to these shores, nothing bad happened to them. Many of them benefited from colonization of the land, taking the resources, and many of them died of natural causes, old age, very rich, very wealthy, with no repercussions. What about former slave owners? And slavery that helped to build the United States of America, Canada maybe to a lesser extent, but mostly the United States of America. Where is their comeuppance? Where is the comeuppance of the slave owners who benefited and became rich off of slavery? And many of them died of natural causes, old age basically, or disease, but no justice was met upon them. Because you see, you might be part of one society, and you might not want to destroy your own society, but the problem with this moral system of self-interest is that there is absolutely no repercussions for dominating a weaker society elsewhere of another country or another nation, because you don't lose. And history is borne testament to the fact that there is no repercussions. And I also use the example of Vikings. You know, the Vikings would go, well, okay, they were just basically the Scandinavians or Norse, and they would go a Viking, which means to go raid. They weren't called the Vikings. They were it's more of it's an activity. Viking is an activity rather than a name. So they would go a Viking into northern England, throughout the shores of France, raping, murdering, and pillaging. And generally speaking, the Vikings didn't really face any repercussions. No one came back to Scandinavia and to counter-invade them and punish them. Because a Viking could go to another country or another land, raid and pillage with no repercussions. As long as they survived the process and no one killed them there, which generally they were very powerful and people were scared of them. But they could do this, and it was actually part of their economy. It was part of the Scandinavian economy to support these raiders who'd come back with loot and pillage. So what could an enlightened self-interest moralist argue to a Viking about why they shouldn't be doing this? Well, you say, oh, you wouldn't like it if it happened to you. Yeah, but it's not happening to them. So then what is there to deter them from raiding and pillaging and killing other people? So this moral system doesn't prevent self-interest of a nation against other nations, especially nations which are weaker. Because you don't destroy your own nation by attacking other nations and dominating them. But also, what if you are powerful within your nation or within your society? So we see that minorities can be discriminated against and are frequently persecuted in many countries without any repercussions done by either the majority group or a privileged elite. And for the most part, they can get away with systematic discrimination. I heard, for example, that, and I'm just bringing local examples because we're in Canada. So I heard, for example, that there is a public outcry about 70,000 or so native Aborigines in Canada, women who've gone missing without anybody investigating what happened to them, where are they, because these individuals, presumably, some people got a hold of them and knew that no one was going to come after them and no one was going to care and either kill them or worse, and there is no repercussions upon the perpetrators as of yet. And I think that the previous Prime Minister made some very derogatory comments about this when it was brought up, saying that in essence, I think it was words that amounted to these people somehow deserved it, or they were people who were not worth that concern. And where is their justice? What's going to happen? They're not going to get that justice back as a minority. Of course, other minorities, either gypsies in Europe, now Muslims in Europe, in the past century, it was also Jews in the United States, France, and England. I don't even need to mention actually Germany. I'm just going to refer to England, France, and United States. Jews were looked down upon, hated, mistrusted, and were persecuted in various different forms. Not necessarily legally persecuted, but they were persecuted and looked down upon by the majority group. Because if you're a member of a majority, there is absolutely no repercussions for you to persecute a member of a minority, especially a minority that is hated, distrusted, of which there is prejudice against. In other cases, we see that those who are rich can flout various laws, such as if you are poor, you have to pay tax. And they argue you must pay tax because society wouldn't function otherwise without the government, and the government requires your tax. However, all these very rich individuals, these rich business people, one of them apparently recently elected to a certain country that should not be named, just south of Canada, can actually avoid tax, use offshore accounts to avoid paying tax because it is beneficial, because there is no repercussions. So if their criterion was, I should be moral because if I'm not, society will break down, but these particular cases don't destroy society. At least society is not being, or the United States, England, France are not actually demolished because all these rich people are not paying tax and are avoiding paying tax. In some cases, their secretaries pay more tax than they do. Nothing happens to them. And so then, why should they be moral then? Is the question. And if the argument is, well, we should try and endeavor to make their repercussions, I'm saying, yes, but you misunderstand. You're relying on fallible and limited human justice in order to make people moral, and yet this tacitly admits that the moral criteria of these people are insufficient in order to make them moral in cases where they're not observed, or in cases where they don't have any repercussions. And this brings me to other point. People can be immoral if the potential rewards outweigh the risk of discovery and potential punishment. So if a person can get away with a crime and the crime is beneficial and they weigh up the costs and benefits and so on, then many of these people will commit crime. Anyone here study criminology or touches upon any subject of criminology? Any psychologists here? No? No? No one? Okay. Well, any criminologist will tell you that criminals are actually, for the most part, very rational. They've made rational choices based on their circumstances, especially if they're in minorities or they are in disenfranchised areas where employment or career prospects are not sufficiently high enough to prevent them from committing crimes or prevent them from viewing crime as a more lucrative option. So they make a rational choice based on the morality of self-interest. And again, self-interest is not sufficient to prevent crimes from occurring. When you know, if you were one of these individuals and your criteria was only benefit and interest and harm, that you know that you might not be caught if you are very clever with how you conduct a crime, then what will stop you? What argument could you bring? What about self-interest without consequence? I was actually speaking to a brother who kindly took me here today, and he was telling me that he works for, let's just say, in the production sector, as in the factories that make juice things, should we say. I don't want to be too specific lest he be recognized by his employers. However, what he was telling me was that if it wasn't for regulations provided by the government, his particular employers would pollute as much as possible because it would maximize their production to do so. They would be able to produce as much as they wanted to, and they wouldn't care, and they wouldn't have to pay all this money to safely get rid of the byproducts and to maintain safety regulations for the workers. And you saw this during the Dickensian era of Victorian Britain. There wasn't those kinds of regulations, and these factories were just only focusing on profit and not focusing on worker safety and the environment and so on. And it's only because of the government imposing these regulations that any of these people actually care, because there would be consequences if they don't, if they're caught, that is. But collectively speaking, climate change is occurring because, on the whole, even despite these regulations, there's still more pollution than the earth can absorb and dissipate. And the kind of thinking is, well, that's for the future, for many people, that's a future problem for future generations. It doesn't affect me and my life now. So then what could you say to that person who doesn't have any children, or might be callous, about their future if they don't have any children, and they just say, I'm going to enjoy my life now, I'll let future generations deal with the problems that will arise at that time due to what I've done. What could you say to them about the consequences? And this is not only an issue you might think with regulation, but we have very powerful, for example, cigarette lobbies, so tobacco lobbies in the United States, lobbies, sugar lobbies, which apparently for a number of years interfered with the official scientific research into what causes obesity, and they blamed fat, and then now it turns out that it's actually not fat that is, or fatty foods that are causing it primarily. It's actually high in carbohydrate foods that have lots of sugar. And the sugar lobbies invested money because it was in their self-interest to do so. And if you're a materialist, then what argument will you bring to them to say it's wrong what you're doing? Because no one was punished. Many people who might have died from diabetes, from heart disease, because of overconsumption of readily available and cheap sugary products, there is no justice for them, no repercussions for them. At best, you could just say that maybe the game is up, well, it's not actually up, but maybe the game will be up and they'll stop being able to exploit that loophole, these corporations. But the damage is done and there is no repercussions against those people that have done it. And of course, there is other cause of an inconsistent morality, and that is the belief, people's belief in equality. And you might think, how does equality produce people being immoral to each other, people doing bad things to each other? Well, envy and jealousy. these two particular human characteristics. What is envy and what is jealousy? Can someone tell me? What is envy? Why are people envious and jealous? You better?
And the have-nots, I guess.
Sorry?
Have and the have-nots.
The have and the have-nots?
Yeah. Someone has something and you don't have it, so you're jealous.
Exactly. And what is the premise behind that? Why would you be jealous?
Something you don't have and you want it because someone else has it. So it's
Is it just because something you want, or is it because someone else has it? I mean, like, what is the premise that, so, okay, someone else has it, you don't, so what?
Well, you're envious, you want it.
Okay, but why do you want it?
Discontentment.
Sorry?
Discontentment.
But why discontentment? Anyone, sisters from the?
I believe that it's a disease of the heart and it's an emotion, and people merely by following the rules made by the humans will never be able to overcome such things. And we need
But why do they arise? Where does jealousy and
because the God who has created us with all these emotions.
but you're saying envy and jealousy is part of human nature? As in, it is something that is part of our innate nature or fitra. You say is envy and jealousy?
Fitra, as goodness is there, the evil is also the part of the fitra.
It's not specific enough, sister.
I think jealousy is a natural instinct that everyone has. If they can get something that they're not able to get, then that's just being jealous. But envious is not a natural instinct. It's wanting something and not wanting that person to have it as well.
Well, I mean, envy and jealousy, they're kind of synonymous. But why? Why would I gave it away at the very beginning of my point.
I think it's because of the feeling of equality that he has that thing, so I should be able to have the same thing as him.
Exactly. The feeling that why does that person have something that I don't when we should be the same? And that is a problem that can't be answered by materialistic morality. And that's why people will start hating each other for no reason. For example, I didn't notice it at first, but sometimes sisters have reported that if a particular woman is very attractive and gets a lot of male attention, other sisters might, or women might start hating that sister because they're envious or there's jealousy because they think, well, what does that sister have that I don't? And it's not fair that that person might have something of them that I don't. And with guys, it might be that someone's born into a rich family and they can go straight into business with money that their parents are going to give them, and yet they themselves, the individual that doesn't have this, they have to strive and work hard to slowly develop that money and build up to get any kind of money to start their own business, to be self-employed or independent. There could be that's kind of envy, that kind of jealousy, that someone has a better car than me, or just any particular attribute, or someone's taller than me, or bigger than me, or whatever. A whole number of different reasons that people are envious and jealous. And it all boils down to the fact that in materialism, yeah, we all want to be equal, but the natural world is not equal. Equality is you could say, from a material perspective, is just a human aspiration that doesn't have any material reality to it. Humans aren't all equal unless we can pretend they're equal, but we're not identical. We have different strengths and weaknesses, abilities, and so on and so forth. So while the law would consider everyone to be equal, but it doesn't translate into equal opportunities, equal standing at birth. For example, a certain individual, sorry to bring up his name, Donald Trump, was born into a rich family, and he had all those benefits of a rich family that was provided to him. Whereas most of us, weren't born into millionaire families and will not have the same opportunities that he did to then become the President of the United States of America. You know how people said everyone has an equal chance of being the President of the United States of America. It's equality. Well, no, in reality, that's not the case. You have to be from a well-to-do background for the most part, or you have to have the support of those who are, and that means you have to fulfill their interests of those who will give you that support. In the thing about democracy, it's not one person, one vote. It's $1, one vote. So there is no consistent morality that can be brought up from a material basis. A person might be good if it benefits them, if it no longer benefits them, and frequently in society there are many cases where it doesn't benefit you to be moral, then people won't. One particular example, which I think most of you might be tested with soon, is once you leave university, you will have to make job applications. And on your resume, or CV as we could say in England, many people are tempted to, shall we say, exaggerate their background and exaggerate their achievements and accomplishments. Why? It's because they know they have to compete with everybody else who's exaggerating and just maybe even just flagrantly lying their achievements in order to compete to get a job. And because lying on your CV or resume, as long as it's not an extremely large lie or a lie that could end you being put into court and so on, which is mostly not the case, is generally without much consequence. In fact, the potential rewards far outweigh any risk or any potential punishment, which is why many people might do it. And what could you tell somebody who is on a purely materialistic basis of their morality to justify what is good and bad? How could you argue to them that it's wrong to lie on your resume or CV when there is no consequence they're going to reasonably face for doing so? So there are so many immoral actions people can commit without society collapsing. And therefore the argument that we should all be moral because we're part of a society isn't a consistent or sufficient basis to justify morality in every circumstance, because most human circumstances that give you tests to do, and you're tested in ways that if you were to fail those tests, society won't collapse. So then what is a basis for morality? What could be a suitable basis for morality? I'd argue that the only basis that could answer all those issues and all those problems is a morality that is based on something which is existent outside of human beings. Something that is not human, because humans are capricious and arbitrary, and no human being could claim authority over any other human being. So if I said be good, why? Well, because Bob said so. Well, then who's Bob? Even if Bob had a fancy hat and robes or was the president of the United States of America, it doesn't mean that they should be obeyed. In fact, in some cases, in many cases, they probably shouldn't be obeyed, as recent events have probably illustrated. So then I would say that there is another criteria, another objective reality beyond humans that forms as a perfect basis for consistent moral life. And that is our purpose and our meaning. You know what makes a good car and what makes a bad car? What is a good car? Can anyone tell me what they think is a good car? And don't say it has to be painted red or have nitrous oxide injection, because they've been watching that film. Was it Too Fast, Too Furious, too much? What is a good car? Just a decent car, opposite to a bad car.
It's a car that gets you from point A to point B.
Okay, and what's a bad car?
That's not going to get you from point A to point B.
All right, yeah. And why did you use the term, why is it good of a car to get you from A to B?
Because that's the function of it, and it fulfills a need that you have.
Okay, that's the function of the car.
Yeah.
You mean the purpose of the car, right? The purpose of the car. Because there's many things that can function as dual functions, but the purpose of the car is to get you from A to B. So if it fulfills its purpose, it's a good car. And if it doesn't fulfill its purpose, it is a bad car. So from a theist perspective, or from a religious perspective, we believe that God created mankind to have a purpose, and this purpose is to choose to follow the natural law of human beings created by God, ordained by God, over other choices, other causalities, other more base causalities of that we see arising in the universe. So we see in the Quran, it says, God is saying, I did not create the jinn and mankind except to worship me. What this means is that a person then who follows the commands of God becomes a good human being because that was their purpose. And if they don't follow the commands of God, that makes them a bad person because they are going against their purpose. And the commands of God, we believe, are consistent with human nature, because our nature was designed to follow these commands. And our commands would see humans be satisfied. However, doing the right thing might not necessarily be pleasurable. You have to study. You have to study for your examinations that you might be coming up soon. Is studying a fun activity? Well, for most people, it probably isn't. Some people might love studying and love exams. But for the most part, especially cramming the day before the examination, as some people do, isn't the most pleasant experience that they could ever think of. But you do it. And why do you suffer? Why do you go through all this hard slog to get to an exam and pass the examination? What are you trying to aim for? You're trying to aim for a greater good in the future for yourself, that you could have the means to support a family, or the means to enrich yourself with an education that might help society in some way. So you go through pain to attain a higher purpose. So pain and pleasure isn't the measure of good and bad. I mean, giving birth is for most people initially not a pleasurable experience. Maybe afterwards it's a pleasurable experience. But it's certainly, people don't give birth because they're seeking pleasure out of giving birth. They're seeking to have a child. They're seeking a higher purpose, and it's a painful experience. So pain, or just going gym. I saw there's some students were working out in the gym as I was in the car park. I thought, wow, gym at university, and saw these bobbing heads up and down. I thought, wow, that's quite interesting. And why are they going through it's not, for most people, it's not pleasurable to do exercise, at least initially, unless you get the adrenaline rush that comes afterwards. But it's not pleasurable. Why do they do that? Because they're seeking a higher purpose. So pain and pleasure is not the measure of good and bad, but only what is based on human purpose. And so if a human purpose is to follow God and to follow God's commands, and to guidance, and to choose God then over other more baser motivations, then this is a good action, because only God can give that value. Because if God made the whole universe and intended everything that exists to exist, so if it's intended, then what exists, including the good and bad, has meaning behind it. Because meaning is only the recording of intentions, right? There's a language, the words. Words have meaning. Why do they have meaning? Because there's an intention behind the word. If I said the cat sat on the mat, I'm conveying a meaning. And why? What is the meaning? It's because there's an intention behind me communicating that to you. And I pick those words to convey an intention to you, that these words, the cat is intended to have a meaning signifying an animal that you have observed. That's why when people invoke that word, you know what they're talking about, because you know that word was intended to have that meaning. So if there's no intention behind the universe, and there's no intention behind all actions, then there quite simply is no meaning to anything. But if the universe was intended to exist, then everything that exists has a meaning behind it, an intention behind it, an objective behind it. And we also see that God, who does not go to sleep, is not ignorant, knows everything that people do, even when in the most darkest of places, in the most dankest of corners, we believe God can see everything you do. So there is no way of escaping any possible recompense that will happen from your actions. So there's no way of hiding from God. And also, God explains things like inequality in this life. So we see that it says in the Quran, God says, He is the one who made you the inheritors of the earth, and He raised some of you above others by degrees to try you in what He has given you. So we see that God intended there to be some natural inequalities or natural non-identicalities, because whatever you're given of benefit in this life that someone else doesn't have, you will be tested on that more than the person who doesn't have that. What did you do with your extra money? Did you help the poor with it? Did you feed your neighbors? Did you start something up that would benefit society with that extra money that you will receive that other people didn't receive? Or if you are somehow more attractive than someone else, than others, you'll be asked, did you use this attraction you have just to have people fawn over you and ogle you and enjoy the attention and enjoy the social respect you get because of your looks? Or did you keep it only for your spouse and focus on them being pleased, whether you're male or female, that is? Not only women here, men could be handsome too, and it's a test for a man as it is for a woman. Are you going to use it in the right way? to actually, as a great gift you give to your spouse and not share with the world, and so on. So everything you're given in this life that you get that others don't get, there is a commensurate recompense and judgment in the next life. More will be expected to those who are given more. So then that doesn't make us envious anymore, or it doesn't make us jealous anymore, because we know that, well, as one narration goes, that it's as hard for a rich person to get into heaven as it is to enter the eye of a needle. It's a common Abrahamic tradition. So as a camel to go through the eye of a needle, the sewing needle has a little bit of a loop at the back of it. It's hard, basically. Rich people will find it harder to in the hereafter, because they'll be asked much more questions about what they did with their superior resources they had on earth. So it doesn't make the poor person envious. It doesn't mean that you can't strive to attain wealth. It doesn't mean that you can't strive to eliminate inequality, but it means you don't have a reason to be envious or jealous. And we also see that religion is counterintuitive, or at least the commands of God is counterintuitive to what you might call a rational, self-interested materialist person might say. So according to, in a materialist basis, you don't help your enemies. Why would you help your enemies? It's very bad to help your enemies. Your enemies are against you. You can't trust them. Why would you aid people who might see your downfall? Whereas we see it said in some of these commands in the Quran, and not equal are the good deed and the bad. Repel evil by that deed which is better, and thereupon the one whom between you and him is enmity will become as though he was a devoted friend. Or another verse in the Quran, let them pardon and overlook. Would you not love for God to forgive you? God is forgiving and merciful. So we see that there are reasons given that if you want to be forgiven for your sins, for your mistakes, you should forgive others. You should, if someone inflicts evil upon you, you return with good upon them. Which wouldn't make any sense, any rational sense, to a person whose basis or criteria was only materialism. Because you might say, okay, well, maybe it could be justified if you make them your friend, then that's fine. But what if they will never be your friend, even no matter how nice you treat them? Why do it? Why continue to be good? Well, without a basis based on something higher than human beings or just the natural world, you'll have no justification for that. Also, I'll see that there's some proven effects of this. This is not just wishful thinking. This is proven effects. We see that a psychologist based at the University of Oregon committed a study of over 26 years of data involving 143,197 people in 67 countries. And what they determined was that belief in the hereafter was a good predictor of less crime, of significantly less crime. So the more people believed in hell, once you account for other variables, the less crime was likely to be committed in that society. We also see that, and I've said this, I used this in my discussions when I was in West Canada. Stephen Fish, a science professor from the University of California, Berkeley. He studied murder rates in different countries with particular focus on Muslims. He determined that on average, the murder rate in a country, homicide rate in a country where it's predominantly Muslims, are 2.4 per annum per 100,000 people. Whereas compared to, let's say, United States, it's 6 per annum per 100,000 people. But taking the world's most populous Muslim country, Indonesia, which has a mix of Muslims and Christians, so there's not just Muslims, there's also other religions there in significant proportions, the murder rate is 1 per annum per 100,000 people. And just to put that into context, you compare this with the homicide rate in Canada, which is 1.68 per annum per 100,000 people. So basically in Indonesia, you are only half as likely to be murdered, almost half as likely to be murdered as you would be in Canada, which means that Indonesia is actually safer than Canada. And it is a country noted for its religious population. And I'll conclude with the ultimate answer to the question whether we need God. And quite simply, we need something to create us in the first place, to create reality itself and to create the very universe that we exist. And not only to create it, but also to maintain that creation, to sustain that creation. And you can argue that morality, you don't need God if you want to choose to be amoral. So if a human wants to be amoral, doesn't care about morality, because need is only required if you require it for an aim. But if you don't have that aim, if you don't aim to be moral, then of course you don't need anything. If you don't want to be moral at all whatsoever. But as much as a human being can deny needing energy and deny the existence of energy, but still need energy to say that and to profess that and need the energy as that concept in order to exist in the first place, likewise, humans need God and need God to continue sustaining them after making them and everything else in the universe. And this concept is unavoidable when we ask where the universe came from and what caused the universe to come into existence. Because if either the universe never made itself, and if that's the case, well, it couldn't make itself because you have to exist first to make yourself. But if the universe basically was made by something else that was not God, and that was made by something else that was not God, and that was made by something else that was not God, ad infinitum, nothing would exist. And it's for the same reason as if I make a domino and I make a supposed infinite rally of dominoes, infinite line of dominoes. Would any of them fall down? Or maybe a better example is if the president of the MSA was probably telling you how long it was going to take for me to arrive here. If the MSA president told you at the beginning of this lecture that it would take an infinite amount of time for me to arrive here, would I actually ever arrive in this class? Anyone? No. So there has to be a start point to the existence of the universe. And of course then the question is, okay, there has to be a start point. But if you're saying it is God, then what made God? Or who made God? And that argument becomes fallacious when you consider that why does the universe need a start point? Why does anything need a start point? Only if it is a finite and limited. Only if it has a certain shape. I usually bring an example of a rock to illustrate this because people say you're going to hold up a man-made object. But I usually ask audiences, how do you know that this bottle was made? And they'll tell me generally, because I've seen bottles being made in documentaries. So that's great, but did you see this particular bottle being made? So they say, no, it's an assumption. Okay, it's an assumption that you think it's made, but how do you know for certain? How do you know for absolute certain that this bottle was created and was made? Anyone? I kind of already given it away actually, but...
It's a logical way of thinking about things. That something that's created by most natural things around are created by human beings. So a rational, logical way to think about it, that it was created by something.
Well, that's an assumption. Maybe this bottle is an eternal bottle that fell to earth. Humans found it, liked the idea, copied it, and made other bottles. But this is the original bottle.
Still irrational. I mean...
Why not?
The analogy.
Okay.
But I usually ask people, if you saw a spaceship in the moon, how would you know that it's not a natural part of the landscape? How do you know that it's something that was created?
Well, that would argue for the point that this bottle is naturally occurring. How do you know it's not naturally occurring and was eternal?
I was going to say that you know something was made because it exists.
How does that follow?
I mean, if you could repeat the question, and then
How do you know that this bottle was created?
Because it exists, and if I can't prove the preceding elements that went into its design and creation, then I only know that it was created because it sits before me and exists.
Well, you don't know it's before you. You've just seen it today, and it could have been made yesterday, or it could never have been made. But how can you determine any of those things? Just by observing the bottle. Well, you can observe that it exists. That's about it. But how do you know for certain that it is created?
We know that it was created only because it sits before us, right? That it does exist.
But something existing doesn't mean that it was created. Just because something exists. How would you demonstrate that axiom? How would you demonstrate that just because something exists means it must have been created?
Because it exists.
that's circular, well, it's self-referential, but well, no. There's a very simple way. I'm going to get one more person, then I'll answer it. Anyone? Just in the front?
Maybe because it's a mixture of stuff together and plastic and paper. So there's not so many mixture of like materials can be in one place, and we can say it's just was created like that.
Okay, she kind of was touching upon it. It's very simple. I'll give you one more person, one final other person. Anyone else?
Well, you can find all the people who were involved in bringing the bottle here and have them testify to how
So testimony, okay. Well, I could bring a few people from the United States of America that will testify that Elvis still exists and wonders around making music. All right, I have to cap it there. So, I know for absolute certain this bottle was made, and usually I bring just a naturally occurring rock because people always get confused between the human element of something and just a naturally occurring item. I could bring a rock and say exactly the same thing. I know it was created quite simply because it is a finite and limited thing. Because why does it not have twice the size of itself? Why is it not a different color? Why is it not of a different mass? Why is it this particular shape and this particular size? So there's only three possibilities. Either it made itself, which is irrational because you have to exist first in order to make yourself. So that can't be the case. Either it basically was never made, but then why does it have its particular shape and a structure that it can't change of itself? It's limited in its shape and structure. So why this particular shape and structure, and why not something else? And the third possibility is that it was made by something external to it, which is the only possibility that makes sense. That's how you rationally know that it was made by something. That's how a geologist who goes out into the fields and the mountains and what have you and sees these rocks doesn't say, well, I didn't see the beginning of this rock, so maybe this rock has always existed. No, the geologist knows the rock was made by something and then uses science to determine what process and materials came together to make this particular rock. So science has to assume, before you even start the science, you make the rational observation that everything that's limited and finite was created. But if you have an infinite series of things that came before this universe, infinite universes, let's say, before this universe, that we all had to depend on to come to our point, obviously nothing would ever exist. So it has to be a start point. And if the start point can't be finite, because if it's finite, then what created it? The problem is what created that start point. The start point has to be then the opposite of finite, what we call infinite, from the Latin infinis, which means not finite. Or you could say غير محدود. From محدود is from the Arabic word hudud, which means limit or boundary. Right? For those who are Arabic speakers, don't have to rely on Latin. So we know that the only possibility that could start the entire, reality, all finite reality. I don't know how big reality is. All I know is that ultimately, at some point, it was created by something that's not finite. And then the next question is, okay, so maybe this thing isn't finite, it's infinite. But might not still be God, might still just be a mindless process. To which the next question is, well, why does this universe look the particular way? No, actually, no, I don't even have to go there, actually. I ask a more fundamental question. Why did this infinite thing make the universe in the first place? Why did it make the universe? I mean, what caused it to make the universe in the first place? If it's the first start point, the first cause. So there's only basically two possibilities. Either something else made this thing make the universe. So I don't want to depict anything. But if I was to say that something external to this first cause made the universe, then basically that other cause is the first cause and not the first cause itself. That wouldn't make any sense. Then someone might say, well, maybe there's an internal mechanism within this infinite thing that makes it make universes. Like a factory, just making universes. Okay, but what is causing this internal mechanism to make universes? If they say, well, maybe there's a smaller mechanism underneath that. Okay, and what's making that smaller mechanism? Or maybe an even smaller mechanism. Like if you open up a watch to see how it works, and there's a smaller watch inside it. Okay, and now what makes that watch work? Or maybe there's a smaller watch inside that watch, and a smaller one, and a smaller one. If you had an infinite an infinitely descending series of smaller and smaller watches, would the watch work? Would the actual watch work? Anyone? What do you think?
There wasn't one?
So, the argument is, there could be an argument that might be advanced is that there's an internal mechanism, maybe within this infinite thing, that's making it make universes without any mind or anyone pressing the button, just automatically. And to bring an example of this, it's like saying that a watch, inside the watch is another watch, a smaller watch. And then inside that watch is another smaller watch. So I'm saying that in this metaphor, or analogy rather, if there was an infinite amount of smaller and smaller and smaller watches, would the hour and the minute hands on the bigger watch move at all?
No,
Why not?
because there's nothing that's running to get to that point. Because you're saying, are they independent on one another?
They're dependent, of course.
Yes, then what? If they're not independent, then
It would be no different to an infinite series of things that has to happen before we reach the clocks, the bigger clock's hand and minute finger moving. So it can't be an infinite series of mechanisms inside it. It can't be something else. So the only conclusion we arrive at is that the beginning of all creation, all universe, the entire universe. I don't know how big the universe is. I don't need to know how big the universe is. I just know that the sum total of all finite things was created by a start point that chose to begin making the universe or universes. There could be more than one universe, that's fine. But whatever this infinite thing is, it started it. It chose to begin making universes. And if it can choose to do something, then it has free will or will. And everything it makes is intended, was intended to be there. And something that is infinite and has intention, that is the definition of God. And that is what we depended on to get to us. There's a funny joke that someone that was coined somewhere, where basically it was a joke with an arrogant man in front of God. An arrogant man said, "I don't need you. I can go. I can basically sustain myself. So I'm going to." And he went to his own piece of farm or dirt or whatever, and God said, "Get your own farm and dirt. Get your own land." And I could even add to that, and get your own body. Make yourself, and then actually it was an adaptation of an argument by Imam Ghazali. Actually, it was an adaptation of an argument that Imam Ghazali pointed that if a person truly wanted to be free from the commands of God, if a person no longer wanted to be under the commands of God, in order to do so, they would have to create their own world, their own universe, create themselves, and be totally detached from everything that God has ever created, and be able to even bring themselves into existence. And then and only then they are free from needing God. Thank you for listening.